Thank you, and thank you also for inviting me to this event. So while we have learned this morning, particularly many of these policy challenges. So Sarah, for example, has talked a lot about how data citation is good and important, but you also have to make the data reusable and understandable, and really go into the details of what is behind that citation stream. And I also learned today also from the presenter after that this challenge of reproducibility is still not solved, and there are many ideas perhaps out there, but it's very hard to implement. So what I'm going to do here is that I would like to give you some insight into the practice of using these identifiers and actually assigning them to different entities, and also building some organizational frameworks and some institutional processes around that actually ensure that what you have there really can call itself a persistent identifier. So I'm not going to talk about RDA specifications or some of these things, but as Pekka just indicated, I'm involved in many projects, and I would just like to give this view into the practice that we are doing. So that also means that first of all I have to talk a bit about where I'm from. So this is the facility I'm working in, the German Climate Computing Center. It's basically a supercomputing and data center for the German climate community, but also involved in international projects. There is a lot of hardware involved. There is also data services, among other things, because we are also at the CoData event. We also host the CoData World Data Center for Climate. And we are involved in many of these data federations and e-science infrastructure activities, among others also, for example, EUDAT, but also the particular climate-related activities. So this is what I will also what sort of shapes the use case that I will be talking about. And when we talk about climate data, particularly about modeling data, we talk about this. For the next years, this is the main driver for all the things that we are currently doing, and that is driving our daily work and also driving the community. This is CMIP6. It's called the Climate Model, the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. So anyone from the climate sciences probably knows about that. Just as a short overview, it's under the head of the World Climate Research Program, an activity where the climate modeling groups and research groups that exist all around the globe are asked to perform common experiments on their individual climate models, and then that will produce a lot of data, several petabytes for the next phase, and this data has to be managed somehow. And in the end, there are several applications for this data. One is, of course, why it's called intercomparison, which means you can do studies across these different climate models and assess their quality in some sense and see what the differences are. You can also use that data to do impact studies. So that is very, very important for policy making. And many of the publications that are written on this huge amount of data that comes out of that also influence finally the reports of the IPCC. So the CMIP6 scheduling, which is now sort of in the warm-up phase and starting next year, and the IPCC reports are somewhat correlated. That is also something to keep in mind. So this is the driving use case for many of the things I will continue to talk about. So now, what do we see as the challenges here, managing that huge amount of data? So first of all, we see that we have a potentially wider user audience. The user audience grows every time these things happen. So first of all, it's of course the researchers that use this data to analyze the climate models. But as I already said, it's also valid for policymakers. So there are research areas revolving around climate impact studies, for example, about decision making also at a regional level, about doing some particular climate services. And these are relying on understanding these amounts of data that are coming from a community that is quite far attached, just quite distant from what those, for example, the impact studies are related to. So this puts up a particular challenge of just providing this understandability of data. That also means that we will have some, we have some need of providing new end-user-oriented services. So in this case, I just put these names here up: processing and analysis services. So you can imagine some cutting operations on data, or providing some algorithms that calculate specific climate indicators. Those will have to work across many data products without the actual end user, the individual scientist, knowing all the details of those data products. So this puts up a particular challenge for preparing that data, but also for making this whole workflow in the end transparent. So, So we see that we have these new challenges of providing these end user services. But of course, we have these resource limitations. Everyone has them, right? So we cannot just hire more people. We cannot just get more money for that. So in essence, we see that we have more objects. We have more diversity on the objects. We have we have a branching out of object types, basically. So it's not like you have just data sets that all look the same, but there are many things attached to the individual data set. For example, individual metadata records, provenance records, links between individual data sets that have some semantic meaning and so on. So we are not thinking about this heap of data just as something that we can orderly arrange on a shelf and just leave it there, but we have to think about these graph structures that are inherent behind these individual objects and their context objects. So it's about making also those graph structures, those context objects, also visible, and also manage them in some consistent way, and also being able to put them to these individual services. But still, all of those things are great, but we have to keep it simple, because we have to maintain that also for a long time. So the CMIP6 cycle runs for about 5 to 6 years, but afterwards there is a lot of activity also going on about, for example, this year we have also had several queries for data coming from one of the previous phases of the project, which of course is up to 10 or 15 years old. And we also have to keep in mind that anything that we do with these services, we may have to keep running for a long time. So that puts additional thoughts on these requirements about managing the resources in some good way. Now, how do we deal with these management challenges? So there are several ideas. So first of all, we want to support the objects through their life cycle. The climate models that run and produce data output, those data objects will be published in some collaborative data infrastructure and assessed by others, so that first errors can be detected. Maybe the model was set up wrongly. Maybe some other mistakes were made. So it's undergoing quite a bit of a life cycle before it even gets published and could just receive a DOI. So there is a lot of things going on before the actual DOI assignment. And if we're talking about understanding the history of these data objects, we have to make sure that this previous steps in this life cycle can also be assessed and audited for someone also coming from an external community possibly. So the idea here is that we give a name to every object, and this is where the PIDs become interesting, because the PIDs are essentially that. We want to make sure that every data set receives an identifier, and that we can also possibly build aggregates and also make sure these graph structures are somehow represented. So this is the main idea that is driving these developments. Then the second idea is we want to automate these tasks because of the resource limitations that we have, which means that we don't want to do things manually. We don't want to shepherd these objects to the steps in this processing chain even before they become published objects. And that means, in a computer science way, that means we have to talk about building some form of intelligent software agents that we can give a task to that can be executed according to some predefined rules. And we have to make sure that these agents are programmed, of course, in a very well way, are of course designed so you can also potentially audit them. But they also rely on the information provided with these data objects to be not too complex. So everything that we put on an object and everything that we bind to an identifier, some elemental metadata, has to be very concise. So we don't run into problems when an agent might not understand that, and also that we don't run into problems when we have to maintain that over a long time span. Then, of course, we want to make these transitions transparent. As I said, data will be generated, it will be published, there may be just some versioning cycles going on, just as Andy also explained, and then finally it will receive a DOI and get aggregated. These steps are also important in contributing to the understanding of the data, and those have to be transparent. And then finally, at the end, when we talk about these end-user services, we want to enable the individual users to pull information to the object that they basically have on their machine or on their individual repository or on their working space. So that also means that we use the PID as an anchor to just grab this context information and potentially build tools that help the users. And in essence, that also means ultimately we don't even want the user to understand all of these details about persistent identifiers and all of the things that are in these context links. That should be hidden, because for most of the users, they will not understand what is going on there. It will just be too much. So it should just be hidden in the background, but we have to make sure that the tools we design are aware of all of these individual links and all of this context information. Now, that means that there is a requirement to understand PIDs not just as a guarantee for object persistency. And that is very important. And I just want to go deeper into that by asking exactly what is persistency. And I'm not sure if this has also been addressed yesterday, perhaps, but let me just provide a few examples here. So, of course, there's a question of the persistency of the object. That is not bound to the use of a PID or a specific PID. So, I don't know. Who does not know what a DOI is in this room? So, no one. Who does not know what a handle is? Okay, everyone familiar with handles? And you know the difference? Very good, very good. So I don't have to talk about the policies here. It's a tricky thing. Then the second thing, of course, is the persistency of the PID itself. The object can be gone. The PID could survive. And that is a very important use case for us, because all of these intermediate objects we will not keep, although we might just assign a PID on them in view of this versioning and other use cases. So that is also a deciding difference. Then there is the persistency of the PID to object link. That could also potentially break, right? If we don't manage it, we have the object, we have the PID, but the connection is gone. That also means, to me at least, one interpretation of citability means this object plus PID plus this link, so the sort of the 3 points combined, that in the end could just be the guarantee to provide this citability, plus of course the metadata that is relevant to give credit. And here is the point about these persistency statements. I know they have been discussed in the past for many years. This is where this is again important, to have these persistency statements to say, okay, we guarantee this link remains. If the object is gone, of course, we have to provide some information. Also, as Andy indicated, there should be just a message, well, we deleted something, but we deleted it because of a purpose. It was not just an accident. And then, of course, we have this persistency of the essential metadata. If we put things in there like a checksum, like links to context information, like for example the object type, we also have to think about making that persistent. So we don't want to include too much of that information, and we also have to think about keeping that information even if the object is gone. So in essence, achieving persistency is not primarily a technical challenge. We have to be sure that we understand these points very well if we design our services and also our processes that manage each of these parts. So being aware that objects may be deleted, what does it mean? Do we have to track that, and so on and so on. So now, from an infrastructure provider view, because that is what we as a data and computing center do, we provide infrastructure. This means that for us, these points about automation and abstraction are very important. So we don't think about anymore just this management of files and file systems. That's also kind of, we talked at some point before 2000. So that is now also a bit, well, doesn't fit the model of the way we are working now. We don't transfer files. We transfer complete objects. We want to make sure that we manage them and not just some individual directories. There's also this management of objects through dedicated services and chains. So when we channel an object through a service chain, we want to be able to to make that process transparent in view of understanding the output object. Then there is a focus on these stable protocols and interfaces and keeping things modular. That's a nice thing to do in software engineering usually, but it also has to be applied here, meaning we have to think about having common agreements about APIs also across communities, and also making sure that they don't change over time too much. And then, of course, I also indicated this already, we want to hide this complexity of this automation machinery from the users. They don't need to know that. It would just not be right for someone to have to understand that in order just to understand the service and what it means. Of course, we have to make sure that we are not lying to them, of course, right? But this is about not keeping the user busy with these details that, well, ultimately they just want to do studies, want to write papers and so on. That's what they get credit for. But we are the ones who must deal with the automation and provide the infrastructure. Now, what does it mean in terms of PIDs? And I just grabbed this picture from Larry Lanham. It circulated in the RDA Data Fabric interest group. And this is essentially the key element of what I'm talking about. We want to make sure that the PID is the binding element between the objects on the underlying layer and the services on top of that. So, and there is always this analogy with the internet domain and how the internet got born, and transferring that to the data domain, making this analogy between the IP and TCP/IP protocol and the PIDs as the binding element. Now, that also means that these object management scenarios bring new requirements to PIDs. Most of all, some of the first things is making this distinction between the object persistency of the identifier, and the attached metadata. So that is something that is very important. And of course, I'm reaching here beyond data citation in some sense. But ultimately, if I cite something with an identifier, I want to provide the user with a means to go through that chain and discover other identified objects that are attached to that. And that relates very much to the idea that, of course, I have to maintain those links and those objects in some form that is understandable. So now, when we talk about PID services, and I'm not talking about the DOI system here, but I believe they have already gone through these exercises. I'm talking about things that we see, for example, in UDAT, where we have the B2 handle service, which provides handles for objects, or I'm not sure if this was mentioned at some point, perhaps yesterday as well, the European Persistent Identifier Consortium, EPIC, which also provides service based on handles. What does it mean to provide such a service and keep these things with automation and persistency in the head? So this means we want to have a federation. No single institution can provide all of these services just on its own, and make sure that these protocols are in place and that the data infrastructure works and so on and so on. So federation is good, it's scalable, but it needs to be organized very well as opposed to having a single institution doing it. So what would be the ingredients? Of course, the ingredients would be the technical expertise. These understandings of common interfaces and protocols, building some services, building some software prototypes and maintaining that. Then, of course, we need the resources. Of course, without money, nothing's going on. We have to have some support services, which means, well, if something goes bad, we want to have a help desk, and also provide training on some of these, particular on these protocols and the technical services or software libraries and so on that we would provide. Then also we have to think about governance mechanisms. So a federation also means that we share the workload, and the nodes in the federation will always try to not to do too much, but also get the most benefit out of that. So it's a very tricky thing politically just to get these governance mechanisms in place, but they are essential. And then we have to have something about the operational schema, as I call it here. So that means the processes, making sure that you can do some reporting, that you can possibly audit the whole federation by a third party. Because ultimately, and that's also what we learned in the morning, PIDs are about trust. And if I cannot trust the operation of this PID federation, how would I trust that actually the persistency of all of these things is carefully managed? So that is also very essential. Now, some details on what challenges we also encountered and had to solve in terms of CMIP 6. So just to give you a glimpse into the things that may actually take a long time. So we want to put a PID into a handle into the header of every netcdf file that we have. So that has been the goal, right? We have agreed on a format, and I can tell you that took quite a bit of haggling about whether to put an HDL in front of that or not. Can have long debates on that. And we had to spend a lot of time on these agreements that ensure the sanity of these PID record containing the extra information. So each object has to get a PID, but on the other hand, no object outside of the scope of this federation of this data infrastructure should receive a PID by accident. So if I encounter a file that tells, oh yeah, I have a PID, and I look that up and it says, well, I don't know that. The resolver says, was not registered. That's a bad point, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen. But it's very difficult actually to really ensure that, because you never know what will happen at individual research groups that set up some federated data node and push data on there. Then again, the PID we put in there is not citable because it comes into existence long before the ultimate publication action takes place. We don't know who the authors are. We don't know who is the publishing agent, basically. We only learn about that later. But still, some file headers of this metadata are extracted and put in the PID record so we can look that up. For example, a checksum, one important point. And of course, PIDs are a new development. We have to make sure that the prototyping is done well, so it's getting acceptance and so on and so on. So now I will just skip that. So this is one thing I would just want to point out. This is the user's reality, and this is nothing we can change. So most of our users use command line tools, and this is where we have to go to just catch them, right? So if I can have all day imagining some web services and some fancy web pages and so on, but maybe they will not use them because that's what they use. So actually we have to provide services at that level. And that takes additional effort, of course, for us just to keep contact with the users and evaluate these services as well. Now, my take-home messages. The use of PIDs for data management and for making these object connections, putting a name to every object, not talking about files and file systems, that puts up new requirements, but also possible benefits. One is this making sure there is transparency and the objects are understandable. The automation and machine usage are key elements. So this is for us the main benefit for making sure that we can deal with the growing numbers efficiently. Data citation is one use case beside others, but of course it benefits from this improved transparency. And these multiple aspects of persistency have to be understood well and may still become relevant if you build these services also in the future. And so that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Tobias. So, questions? So, actually, you talked at the kind of a general issues about kind of PID system. So what's the kind of the specifics of the system that you are using at this climate center?
So we are doing all of this with the handle system, and later when the data is ready for formal publication and long-term archival, of course we assign a data side UI on that, and then of course we have to think about these transition steps. Right, so the data may actually already have a handle, and there may be this additional information attached to it. So we still have to figure out how to attach that to the DOI landing pages in some form that is actually discoverable.
Yeah. So I'm not at all familiar with all these kind of different alternative PID standards or so. To what extent are they somehow intertranslatable? So if kind of one kind of a service uses one system and another one uses another one, so does this create difficulties?
So yes, that would create difficulties. So if you were talking about, for example, interoperability between URNs, ARCs, and DOIs, it's mostly most discussions around that are about how you would use that for citation, for example, and how you would perhaps assign make sure these policies are clear. But at the technical level, unfortunately, it's different systems. So in the RDA working group that I co-chaired on the PID information types, we came up with an API to address these things. But of course, that relies on adoption by the individual PID providers. And because the use cases are not clear up to now, it's a chicken and egg problem in some form. So that, of course, that would address some of these issues, but it's also not a silver bullet. That's also what one has to understood. So it's in this case we are sort of evading the interoperability issues because we are using the handler system, which is the technical foundation also for the DUI system. So the differences are not too large at the technical level.
Okay. So, well, I will take this.
Yeah, I have a question which is, it's related to what you presented, but because I know you've been involved in other activities as well. The challenge in the future will be to link, we will most likely have to give we have digital objects which goes down to individuals, computers, God knows what. Linking this all together will be future, and that I remember is it the Tor project which tried to link these. How is that part of the digital object identifier going forward? Because definitely we need to link everything in a way together, not just data sets.
Yes, that is correct. The Thor project looked in particular at ORCIDs and data sites in data site UIs. From my perspective, there are very good opportunities if you do these bidirectional linking, and that is also what the Thor project, as far as I understand, that has been working on, to make sure that you can migrate from you can transition the user from one side to the other, and you can also have some metadata exchange. So so the current planning that we have is that we want to encourage our users, the ones that actually ultimately are the authors of the data sets, to have ORCIDs and submit them when they fill out the final publication forms. And if that happens for enough people, we can just include that, for example, on the landing pages and make sure that there are that these services that know about the handles and know about the individual context information on data sets also can retrieve, for example, the information that is in ORCID records. And that would be an essential benefit from projects such as Thor, to make sure these connections are actually there, and that you can have a service that goes through them.
Okay, so I think we need to be moving on. So let's thank Tobias.
Thank you.